the subject of legal controversy up through the 1990s with the NEA, for example, and in the 1920s. So I'd be interested in hearing from Amanda about the significance of this particular case and why this was the first LGBT case from the ACLU. And then perhaps also talk about the legacy of this play. We were talking before, there was a recent production in London a few years ago, but it has not been on Broadway since the 1950s. So I'd be interested to talk about why that's the case, why this play hasn't actually been done. Is it because of the controversy, or do people feel it's not a very good melodrama? So let me turn it over to Jordan and Amanda to get us started.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm happy to start off by talking about the ACLU piece of it and concur in everything you said about this was an excellent, unique production, weaving together the legal stuff and the play itself and tying together the issues of, is anyone really being harmed here, both within and outside the work? The ACLU is the nation's oldest and largest civil liberties organization, founded in 1920 in response to the Red Scare and the clampdown on political dissent that was happening in the wake of World War I. And then when this controversy occurred in Boston in the mid-30s, it was the first time that the ACLU had taken on anything with a gay component as one of the unpopular causes that the ACLU was willing to represent. And as you saw with the affidavit from Dorothy Parker, that she and other leading lights of the theater at the time stepped up to discuss this in the public discourse as a problem, even if homosexuality was assumed to be a moral evil and a crime, as it was throughout the United States at that time, that there was a problem from an artistic perspective with preventing any discussion and any creative presentation that touched on homosexuality, even in such a dark light as this play. So, as you saw, the ACLU took on the case. It was litigated in federal court. It was not successful. But I think that's illustrative of how the different kinds of work that we do on these issues tie together. It's not just about litigating in court. Sometimes it's legislative lobbying. Often it's just a matter of public education. And the fact that this controversy happened, that so many famous people participated in one way or another, called a lot of attention, not only to Lillian Hellman's play, but to the topic, and that there could be artistic merit to something touching on the controversial issue of homosexuality. There was a long period after that where gay issues were not the focus of the ACLU. It took until the Stonewall riots and the more public nature of a gay rights movement in the 60s and 70s for that to change substantially. The ACLU brought its first lawsuit seeking the right to marry on behalf of a same-sex couple in 1970. That, of course, was also unsuccessful, and it took decades for that tide to turn. I worked for the LGBT and AIDS project of the ACLU, and that was founded in 1986. So it's been a long progression of getting to a place where we're relatively comfortable with having public conversations about the issue, and that, of course, has facilitated change in terms of civil rights and civil liberties for gay-identified people.
I have to agree that the play in this case is so significant, and the way, from my perspective, how it's still so significant is in terms of the representation of gay and lesbian characters in the American theater and the way that censorship has been in balance with these representations really for the better part of a century. And I think to really appreciate the significance of this play, it's important to remember that this was actually a great success on the New York stage. And that just 7 years previously, in 1927, the Broadway theaters had been raided by the New York State authorities for immoral plays. There were 3 plays in particular that were raided. One was a rather trivial kind of sex comedy called The Virgin Man. One was a play actually by Mae West, starring Mae West, called Sex. It had already been running for 11 months, but the police came in and shut it down. But the third play was a French import called The Captive by Edouard Bourdet. And these 3 plays were successfully, taken off the boards for all intents and purposes. But in the aftermath of it, many of the New York critics thought that The Captive, which was a lesbian drama, was unfairly targeted. That the other two plays were sort of tawdry and sensational, but this French play was actually rather highbrow and a good piece of theatrical art. And I think that the producer of this play, The Children's Hour, recognized this dynamic. And so when he produced The Children's Hour, he, first of all, kept the authorities out of the New York theater until the play had opened. So in other words, the critics had their say first. And the critics praised this play as a legitimate piece of theater. One critic, at least, I believe, called Lillian Hellman the American Ibsen. And it was taken quite seriously. And this did indeed, in the case of New York, help, if you will, inoculate the play against being prosecuted under the Wales padlock law, which did prohibit any representation of, sexual deviance or immorality in the theater. And so Hellman played his cards quite wisely in New York and succeeded. The play ran for nearly 2 years, won awards, although not the Pulitzer, because a member of the Pulitzer committee said he would not even see the play. And I think it would have been a major victory for Hellman if he could have succeeded in Boston, because as I'm sure many of you know, Boston had the reputation of having some of the most stringently enforced censorship laws in the country, and that's the famous phrase, banned in Boston, which producers often frequently use to help promote their work, to say, you'll love this play, it was so sensational, it was banned in Boston. But this had, I think, to do with the culture and society of Boston, that there was still very much the old Puritan, wealthy class that wanted to control the culture. And this was an issue not just about, sexuality in this case, but also around immigration, that they saw the influence of immigrant culture somehow polluting the American culture. And they wanted to take a stand against that. So in a kind of, collusion between, frankly, newspapermen like William Randolph Hearst and organizations like the Society for the Suppression of Vice, which in Boston, I believe, was called the Watch and Ward Society. And then obviously with, the mayor, as we saw in this piece. And all these influences came together to make sure that even though Hellman had succeeded in New York, he did not succeed in Boston. And so in terms of this play and its position in that constant battle about state censorship, it's really quite significant.
Well, since we do have just a limited amount of time, let me open it up to the audience. We would welcome your questions. We have microphones on both sides, so if you have a question that you would like to ask Amanda or Jordan, please come on up.
Hi, yeah, I was going to make a reference to Mae West's play, and I'm glad you did too. You do know, I'm interested in the ACLU because the Motion Picture Code had come out just about the same time as Hellman was writing this. Obviously, all the laws have come down in movies and print against heterosexuality generally. The ratio is huge and everything too, and of course, I was wondering, that when they made the movie of this, these three, it was turned into a heterosexual thing. It would have been so nice if the ACLU just did something about this massive censorship that was being done, self-regulated and everything too. And that was never contemplated by ACLU. They never could have stood up to Hollywood, right? And these codes, which are so farcical if you were to read them. And they lasted from 1933 until the motion picture ratings with Jack Valenti in the 60s. That really did a lot of damage. Where were you guys then?
Well, part of the problem there is the complicated public-private dynamic that was governing Hollywood, and there is still a complicated public-private dynamic with censorship of the arts and popular culture, as we saw in the Tipper Gore era with the content of recorded music and whether that was a proper matter for the federal government to be intervening in. Part of the problem with the Hollywood codes was the structure that sort of imposed a legalistic requirement and an absolute bar on particular kinds of content on any film that would be distributed, but in a technical sense, it was a private industry internal regulation, and that made it difficult to intervene in a legal sense, and particularly for the ACLU, which is focused on defending Bill of Rights freedoms and representing individuals in controversies, usually against government, that it wasn't a good fit.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
One thing I would just add to that is to remember in terms of this time period, every state in the Union had sodomy laws on the books that made gay and lesbian relationships illegal. And in many cases, gay and lesbian people could be arrested simply for being openly known as gay and lesbian in a public place. This is really, while we can certainly address the issue of censorship, the larger cultural significance of the illegality of gay and lesbian identity, I think can't be overlooked here as part of the real context for this too.
Hello. Thank you very much for being here, and the play was magnificent. I'm always very curious about the cycles of prohibiting certain behavior, and then it opens, and you mentioned Mae West, and there was an article just recently in the Financial Times, I believe it was there, about how risque movies were in the 20s, and then when the Depression came along, all of a sudden, no double beds and all of that changed. But then, and with homosexuality throughout the ages, how at times it's accepted and then not accepted. Thank you.
It's an interesting point in terms of like the larger social question of legitimacy. I thought it was interesting actually in the court transcripts that we heard when the lawyer pressed the mayor about, what kind of sexual relations need to be banned from the stage? If a man talks about his wife, that is a sexual relation. That is not banned in the theater. So the question of the legitimacy of the sexual relation itself, I agree, I think is part of the larger social question. And of course, in some ways that does tie in then with the more recent events surrounding the legalization of same-sex marriage, right? To what degree does society see this relationship as legitimate and therefore able to be represented on the legitimate theater?
Why this change? Why all of a sudden open and then...
I'll throw that to you.
I think part of that is part of the broader cycle of advance and backlash that we see in all sorts of areas of the law and all sorts of areas in the culture. As we were walking in, we were seeing clips from the Windsor Supreme Court arguments where just this year the Defense of Marriage Act, federal restriction on recognizing marriage as same-sex couples, was struck down, and that Defense of Marriage Act was passed in '96 in response to an upsurge in gay rights advances, and it provided a big step backward. During that same period, there were a lot more pop culture representations of gay and lesbian people, gay and lesbian relationships, and that certainly fed the sea change that led to changes in the law more recently. It's a bigger pattern, I think, that as advances happen, people who are uncomfortable with those advances often have the power to do the reverse, and we take a couple of steps forward and a couple of steps back.
I agree, and I think even in the realm of the arts and representation, we see that, where in the 1920s, there actually was more of a burgeoning gay and lesbian culture that could be seen. So whether there was, like the drag balls up in Harlem, which my colleague here has written about, or about the so-called pansy craze, which if some of you saw the play The Nance with Nathan Lane recently, it sort of depicted that. But in the wake of this, we saw the implementation of censorship laws on the New York stage in 1927, the Wales Padlock Law, and then as the gentleman here pointed out, in 1934 with the kind of enforcement of the Hays Code. And so there too, I think it was the sort of the expansion, or rather the gay and lesbian presence became more known, and there was fear about that. And so the backlash that Amanda describes, I think absolutely, that we do see these cycles.
I would just also add that what we think of in terms of acceptance, this was clear even in the transcripts, that's New York. It's okay for New York or for Harlem or the West Village, because these are these little places of sinful activity. But when it starts to reach other places like Boston, then it can be a real problem.
In fact, what was it? It was one of the people depicted in the court scene that says, if you want to see it, go to New York and see it.
Yeah.
You want to see it in Boston?
Yeah.
Maybe one last question?
Sure, one more question.
I know that the Hays Code was set up because they were dealing with things on a state-by-state level, and it was too hard, so they thought they were going to self-censor themselves. So I guess my question is the ACLU, I'm curious, the kind of cases they do they choose to more go state by state, or is it a national thing? Like, where is it more successful? I know this is a big question, but maybe you can enlighten me a little.
Absolutely. It's a question that we discuss for days and days on end. As an organization that's trying to make change for the nation as a whole and protect individual liberties for everyone, in general, we're trying to figure out what is the most efficient way to make change for the people who need it most on as broad a scale as possible. So sometimes that might mean pursuing something that appears relatively small, like a local production in a low-level court, if it's going to establish a precedent that reaches everyone. Other times we might start out trying to go broader. I'm working on a class action lawsuit on behalf of all the same-sex couples in Virginia, trying to secure them the freedom to marry. It's a question of what does the law look like, what does the public education need look like, and what is going to be the most efficient strategy given our limited resources toward getting to the goal for everyone.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Frank.
Yeah, just for you to know, there will be a little get-together called the Archive Bar around the corner. It's on 36th Street on the south side in case you have some additional questions or you... Also, the actors will be there. And I think, again, we should say thank you to Ashley for terrific directing. And before the actors, and also